This is On Becoming a Healer with Saul Weiner and Stefan Kertész, two physicians reflecting on how better self-knowledge makes us more effective in medical practice and education and is essential to joy in being doctors. We do this in our podcast by telling a story and reflecting on themes of judgmentalism, engagement, boundary clarity, ego, and caring. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
So, Saul, what are we talking about today?
Well, I don't feel good about this story, but I think it's important to talk about anyway.
Okay. Well, I'm interested. Go ahead. What happened?
So, this goes way back. I was an intern at the time, and there was a senior resident who I admired, and at the same time, he sort of horrified me. It was one of those weird things. He was just very, very smart and charismatic, but at the same time, there was something about him that I knew was a little bit frightening. Nevertheless, I was a bit infatuated. And one day we were all up in the conference room where we would eat dinner during calls. We typically got takeout. I remember that every night it was a big decision about where we were going to order in from. And he came in with a big smirk on his face and a story to tell. The story was that he had gotten called down to the ED, and there was one of those patients who just comes back over and over again. And Robert, which is not his real name, explained how he decided to drape an NG tube around his neck when he went into the ED. And
let me stop you. What's an NG tube?
Oh, it's a nasogastric tube. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And the thing about NG tubes is they're intended to go down, well, they go down your nose, but they're pretty fat, and they're intended to be wide enough that you can actually suck stuff out of the stomach. So he went in there with this NG tube draped around his neck, and he didn't say what it was for, but he did tell the patient that they were going to have to stick a large tube up his penis in order to drain urine out. And the guy looked horrified when he saw this big old tube hanging around Robert's neck. And of course, the point of the joke, the ruse, was that he didn't say anything, but he scared the bejesus out of this guy. And the guy just got up and basically ran out of the ED. And when Robert told this story, everybody laughed. I laughed. It just seemed funny at the time, although I also knew there was something wrong about the story. So that's how Robert got rid of a patient he didn't like. And the story's kind of haunted me ever since.
So let me ask you this. When you think back, did you say this fellow was somebody he didn't want in the emergency room? And what do you think is the reason he didn't want this patient in the emergency room?
Well, that's a good question. Many of us have heard about the ugly acronym GOMER, which is Get Out of My Emergency Room. And it's this idea that there are certain patients who pester interns and residents because they're just coming back over and over again, and the resident is just exhausted, and it's yet one more of the 12 or so patients we have to admit during the night. And, invariably, these individuals are really low on the socioeconomic ladder. They're often... they may be homeless. If they're not homeless, they're in some way marginalized and essentially powerless. And they may be coming back to the ED because of the fact that they don't have a place to spend the night. And so they may come in and say that they have some sort of medical issue. And we saw a lot of people like that. And
the key, if I hear it right, is the trick is this doctor wore a tube around his neck and shoulders that would never be actually used on a urethra, but basically implied that was exactly what was going to be done.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of the joke, if you want to call it a joke. Although, of course, it's not funny, but it seemed funny at the time. But the idea is that he was very subtle. He didn't say to the patient, I'm going to stick this old fat tube up your penis, which, of course, he wasn't going to do. But it was it was kind of a hoax. It was a way of frightening the patient just through implication that this is what was going to happen.
At the time you heard the story, you laughed.
I did. And, I don't know, looking back, how much of that laugh was just wanting to be accepted, how much of it was just the fact that I kind of was, as I said, sort of infatuated by this guy just because he was so charismatic. Even though I wanted to be liked by him, it kind of reminded me of how I reacted to a kid in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade who was sort of similar. He was just something sort of a little bit evil about him, but just very charismatic. And I found myself, like many other kids, I think, wanting to be liked by him. And so that was sort of the quality that I felt around him. And then, of course, there's also the possibility that I just kind of thought it was funny, too. It was sort of clever. I was tired, and I kind of bought into some degree that sort of burned out culture of being a resident. and seeing patients as just kind of an obstacle to getting sleep.
People hear these stories and I wonder if they think they're exceptional, that this is kind of a bizarrely cruel moment. And I'm trying to ask myself as I ask you this, do we feel like there's a lot of instances where patients are dismissed or gotten rid of or ejected in some way, basically either with cruelty or with something less than cruelty? Does that happen a lot, or is this just an exceptional situation?
Well, that's a great question. We don't have a way of collecting data on how often stuff like this happens. But in this case, obviously, the patient, first of all, could have had a real healthcare need. Who knows whether this was really just somebody who was trying to come in from the cold. And by the way, even if they were trying to come in from the cold, it might have been pretty damn cold out there. And maybe sending him back out could have caused significant harm. Also, as a matter of human dignity, obviously, this was a calamity in a sense. It was highly disrespectful. Certainly not what being a physician is all about. And how often does this happen? Who knows? And what constitutes this? Like, is this the worst? Is this somewhere in the middle? I don't know.
One of the themes that we've talked about with this one, or thought about for today's session, was the notion of judgmentalism, which is where, for whatever reason, the patient is wound up in front of the physician or some other health professional, and the health professional judges. Is the moment where you say, I don't want you here. I'm going to figure out how to get rid of you. Is that judgmental?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things I think about is that when Robert went down into the emergency room, although I wasn't there, it sounds like he didn't think about the interaction as with any sense of shared humanity. He didn't say to him, "Hey, Mr. Davis," I don't know, I'm making up a name for him. "Hey, Mr. Davis, I've seen you here a lot. What's going on in your life? Like, what's happening?" The whole idea of saying that probably either didn't occur to or didn't interest this resident. He was thinking completely in terms of wanting to get the patient out of the ER, not having to admit him. And so I think there was a fundamental failure to engage or even to know how to engage or to see this person as a fellow human. And then, of course, once you don't have that sense of shared humanity, it's very easy to just be judgmental, as you put it. And then what does it mean to do that? And I think that sense of being judgmental, of devaluing the other person, is probably closely tied to status and power and being marginalized in some way, and somehow seeing that person as less worthy of your time and your effort because of assumptions that you're making about them. So in that respect, I think it's judgmental.
Yeah, I can hear many echoes in this one, because you could imagine that even if this person was, quote, a frequent flyer who appeared in the emergency department, if there were demarcations of social power and income, it would probably be impossible for a resident to convince themselves to engage in that kind of intimidation. Even if they felt offended by the visit and didn't engage, they still wouldn't intimidate the patient out of the emergency room because they'd understand there could be repercussions. So, I have no idea what the race of this patient was, but if they look poor and often don't have pigment like mine, I do think the medical system thinks it can get away with a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's reality of the system. And I think the question, of course, becomes, as part of that system, how do we want to behave? And I think here, one thing that I find helpful is to distinguish between what we may be thinking or feeling inside and what constitutes appropriate behavior. I think that as a resident or as an intern, you can start to depersonalize interactions with patients. And that can become a lifelong pattern. I remember one of my attendings on oncology saying that, every patient should die on a protocol. And so that, in other words, that type of attitude is long lasting. And the question, of course, is, we may have thoughts like, boy, I wish this patient would get out of my emergency room. But the question, of course, is, how do we behave and what do we do in those circumstances? And I would submit that if we can distinguish between what we're feeling and what we should be doing, that's an important first start. And one of the best ways to respond in a situation like that is to lean forward, is to just, despite what you're thinking or feeling, is to say to the patient, "Hey, Mr. Davis, what's going on? How are you today? Why are you here?" In other words, to respond to that person as a fellow human.
And I think you have to fake it sometimes. That is, when you're exhausted or you don't want to see them, it can be very helpful if, and I speak from personal experience here, if I can reach inside myself and say, okay, I'll bite. Why are you here today? What's going on? And try to manufacture as much enthusiasm for that question as possible, which, strangely enough, when I tell myself I'm going to look like I'm curious, I start to feel curious. And that sort of breaks the part of me that's just tired of the whole damn situation. So why are you here? What's going on?
Yes, I think that's really important. I think that if you just open your mouth and speak to that person as just a fellow human with the basic assumption that they're sensible and that if they're showing up in the ER all the time and they're here now, that they've got their reasons. And, just that's a form of respect because you're just sort of taking them at face value. You're saying this person must have their reasons. And that's the beginning of caring, because once you start to have that conversation, then now you're relating on a level playing field. And I think that's the beginning of engagement and caring. And then all of a sudden, the idea of tricking them into thinking that you're going to stick a large tube up their penis starts to just seem wrong.
Yeah. So the other thing I want to ask you about, of course, is the problem of being the junior person on a totem pole when you see and hear something that you know is vaguely wrong. Is there assuming a medical intern or somebody entering internship were to listen to this, is there an obvious thing to do when a person above you shows that they have behaved abysmally?
Well, that's the question. When you call somebody out. And I think that's tough. I think that, when you're the intern and your senior resident says something like this, it's a problem, not just because of what they've said, but because of what just happened as a result. What you just learned is that a patient was scared out of the emergency department who was trying to get on your service by essentially being misled. And so I think as an intern in that situation, you do have an ethical obligation. After all, you're also a doctor on that service. So ideally, I think you do have to speak up, although I realize that's a tall order.
I would acknowledge we probably won't figure out all about how to do that today. But in a weird way, the first step I might consider, without necessarily calling out explicitly what's horrible, is to look at the senior resident and say, can you tell me why they actually are in your emergency room? I can ask that question for two reasons. One is it might actually spur some reflection. It isn't actually terribly challenging. It isn't one that puts high risk on me as the intern. But finally, if I decide later I want to report on the event to an attending or to the program director, that information could be very helpful because the response will be telling. If the third year resident says, I don't care, that says something different than I know he's homeless and I don't have a tool to deal with that versus I'm too tired. And you get them to reflect a little bit on whether they asked elementary question number one, and then two, you get information that you can share with your program director if you decide that that's where you want to go.
Yeah, I like that approach because instead of calling them out on bad behavior, you're using a questioning approach that stays focused on something that is really indisputable, which is, did the resident actually determine whether this patient had a medical need? And if they didn't, then sending them out that way is a particularly unacceptable, even on a strictly biomedical basis. And as you said, that might get them thinking as well. And if you have to report it, which I think you probably would, as you said, it gets you the information you need.
So at this point, I'd like to close this out. And our thought is I'd like to offer some of my take-home messages and then give you the last word. So preliminarily, this story is about a moment which I think begins with a feeling we all have, which is there are moments in medical care and I think nursing care where we just don't want to see the next patient. And that when that moment happened here, the story is of intimidation as a way of getting rid of the patient. I think there are lots of ways in which we manage to make people go away from us, which run afoul of what we wish to be as healers. In this case, the probable antidote for a person of goodwill is to lean into the case and ask, you're here a lot. I'd like to know more. Just asking the question. And if it were the case that this resident or whoever it is discovered that they have no capacity to ask that question because they're so exhausted then that's a good moment to go speak to the people who set up your working conditions and to say, this is where I found myself. I no longer have the ability to ask elementary questions. I need help to figure out what's going on. And finally, I think when one is the junior person on the totem pole and sees something that doesn't look right in healthcare, it can be very hard to sort out what to do. We don't have a formula for that. But one reasonable thing is to ask the person whose behavior you've observed if they have an idea about what they were responding to and if they can tell you what they just assessed and what they determined needed to be done. And those are my current summations. Saul, do you want to offer a last word?
I think that's excellent. What I would just say to others who might find themselves in the situation that I was in, looking back on it, I regret that I laughed, that I kind of succumbed to my need to be accepted, and that I didn't speak up in a way that might have protected the patient. And, just as I think you're taught as an intern that if a resident asks you to do something that's medically unacceptable or takes actions that are medically unacceptable, you do have to speak up. I would say that applies here as well. And if you don't do that, you'll wonder probably, as I have, what the consequences are.
Well, Saul, thanks very much. And I thank our listeners for joining us on the first episode of On Becoming a Healer. And we look forward to hearing from people who are interested in these stories or sharing others. And we'll come back soon.